You stand in the Hippodrome of Constantinople, and the air itself feels heavy with death. The roar of the crowd that once shook these walls has been replaced by silence so vast it presses against your chest. The sand beneath your feet is no longer the pale dust of chariot races. It is dark, sodden, and sticky, soaked with the blood of 30,000 souls. Their bodies are piled in grotesque mounds, twisted limbs tangled together, faces frozen in terror. The stench is unbearable, a choking mix of smoke, iron, and charred flesh that sears your nostrils and makes your stomach lurch. The cries of the dying still echo faintly, carried by the cold winter wind that slips through the broken arches. You hear the clang of swords being sheathed, the crunch of boots over bone. The Hippodrome, once the jewel of the empire's pride, is now a graveyard carved out in a single afternoon. Not far from this sea of corpses, in the marble halls of the palace, a different kind of silence had ruled only hours before. There, an emperor shook with fear. Justinian, the man who claimed dominion over the Eastern Roman Empire, was ready to abandon it all. His hands quivered as he considered flight, his thoughts consumed not by his people, but by escape. The empire itself seemed poised to collapse under the weight of his hesitation. And then, another voice rose, a voice sharper than steel, colder than marble, and stronger than any army. "I will never live without this purple," she declared, her gaze fixed, her spine unbending. "For me, it is the noblest shroud." Those words cut through the air like a blade. The room stilled. In that instant she, Theodora the Empress, seized the moment. A woman who had once been sold, degraded, discarded, now bound an emperor to his throne. She chose blood over surrender, death over flight, power over mercy. The orders were given. The generals obeyed. Soldiers poured into the Hippodrome, swords flashing, spears thrusting, arrows raining down. What began as rebellion ended as massacre. And the cost was 30,000 lives. Freeze this image in your mind. An empress draped in purple, unflinching, while below her city drowns in blood. Ask yourself, how could a girl trafficked from the gutters of Constantinople rise to this moment, to command death on such a scale, to decide the fate of an empire with a single speech? Before we go back to her beginnings, tell me, would you have stood your ground with Theodora, or fled like Justinian wanted? Drop your answer in the comments, and if you want more forgotten stories like this, join us here on Echoes of Time. The massacre lies frozen in your mind, but to understand how Theodora arrived at such a moment, you must step backward, back into the shadows of her childhood, where survival itself was a daily negotiation. Her story begins not in marble palaces, but in the dust and stench of the Hippodrome's underbelly. Her father, a bearkeeper in the arena, lived and died by the whims of the beasts he tended. When he passed away, the fragile thread that held his family above starvation snapped. Theodora was still a child when poverty wrapped its claws around her. The family had nothing. No patronage, no fortune, no protection from the cruelty of the streets. Her mother, desperate and hardened, sought a way to feed her daughters. She remarried, not out of love, but out of necessity, binding herself to another man of the circus. Yet even that union could not shield them. Soon, her daughters, including the young Theodora, were thrust into the theater. But this was no place of art or admiration. In Constantinople, the stage was a mirror of humiliation. Performers were jeered, mocked, and treated as less than human. And for young girls, the boundaries between actress, dancer, and object of exploitation dissolved quickly. The theater in Byzantium was not merely a stage. It was a marketplace. Here, men of power and appetite prowled the wings, seeking entertainment not only from performances but from the performers themselves. Theodora, scarcely beyond childhood, was trafficked into this world. Her body treated as commodity, her dignity stripped away. To the crowd, she was spectacle. To those who paid for her company, she was disposable. Yet in this furnace of degradation, something hardened within her. Humiliation became her teacher. Every jeer, every exploitative glance, every indignity carved survival instincts into her bones. She learned to read faces, to anticipate moods, to mask her own fear with wit. She learned that beauty could be currency, that submission could be feigned, and that every humiliation endured could be repaid in time. Much of what we know of these years comes from Procopius, a man who despised her and sought to paint her in the darkest possible light. His secret history drips with venom, describing acts designed to destroy her memory. We may never know how much of it is fact, how much slander. But what is certain is this: Theodora's childhood was not one of innocence. It was forged in the shadows of the stage, in a world where survival demanded cunning long before she would ever wear a crown. From these beginnings, poverty, exploitation, the cruelty of a society that consumed women and cast them aside, emerged a girl who refused to remain broken. Every scar became armor, every wound became resolve, and every humiliation sharpened her hunger for a life where she would never again be powerless. If you've just discovered us, this is the kind of raw, unfiltered history we uncover. Subscribe to Echoes of Time so you don't miss the stories textbooks like to soften. And if you don't want to subscribe, tell me why in the comments. I want to hear your reason. From the grime of Constantinople's theater, Theodora's path bent toward exile. She caught the eye of Hysebulus, a provincial governor posted in Libya. For him, she was ornament and concubine, an ornament carried far from the empire's glittering heart to the edge of its deserts. There, she lived not as a wife, not as an equal, but as a mistress, her life bound to the whims of a man who believed he owned her. At first, it must have seemed an escape. A roof, fine clothes, meals more secure than she had known as a child. Yet beneath that surface, the same chains remained. Hysebulus treated her not as partner but as possession, and when his interest cooled, he cast her away. There was no protection, no honor, no place left for her in his household. The dismissal was brutal in its simplicity. She was nothing, discarded on foreign soil, stranded in a land not her own. With little more than her body and her resolve, Theodora faced a choice: surrender to ruin or claw her way back to the capital. She chose the harder path. Alone, she made the long journey back to Constantinople, a trek through hardship and humiliation that might have broken another woman. But Theodora was no longer the girl forced onto the stage, no longer the mistress waiting for a man's favor. Each betrayal carved into her something sharper: a hunger, a clarity, a refusal ever again to be at the mercy of another's will. When she returned to Constantinople, she carried with her a new armor of ambition. No longer content to survive, she would learn to manipulate, to maneuver, to seize the hidden levers of influence. She began to cultivate acquaintances among the powerful, weaving herself into circles of patronage and alliance. She had learned, through degradation, the subtle arts of persuasion. She had mastered the skill of reading the ambitions of others, aligning herself with those who could advance her. Theodora returned not broken, but reborn. Her mind sharpened by betrayal, her will steeled by abandonment. She understood now that survival was not enough. To secure her future, she needed power, and she would not rest until she found the path to it. The seeds of her ascent had been planted, though no one yet could imagine how far they would grow. From mistress to exile, from humiliation to return, Theodora's life was a chain of brutal transformations. If you want to follow every twist in this journey and uncover more of history's darkest metamorphoses, subscribe to Echoes of Time. And if you won't, tell me why in the comments, because I want to know what keeps you from stepping deeper into these shadows. Back in Constantinople, Theodora's ascent quickened. In the corridors of power, whispers began to circle. A woman of sharp tongue, sharper wit, and a presence that unsettled even seasoned statesmen. Among those whispers, one name began to repeat with mounting intensity: Justinian, heir to the throne of the empire. He noticed her first as others did, perhaps through gossip, perhaps by chance encounter. But unlike the rest, he did not dismiss her as an actress or a courtesan. He watched her, studied her, and became enthralled. For Justinian, Theodora was not simply beautiful. She was unbreakable, a survivor forged in fire. Where others saw scandal, he saw steel. What began as fascination deepened into obsession. He wanted her, not as mistress or ornament, but as partner. Yet there stood a wall between them, Roman law. The statutes were clear. No senator, no man destined for high office, could marry an actress or a prostitute. Theodora's past chained her outside the gates of legitimacy. And standing guard behind those gates was Empress Euphemia, wife of Emperor Justin, Justinian's own uncle. Euphemia detested the match, despised the thought of a trafficked girl sharing the imperial bed, and blocked every path that might lead to their union. But power is patient. Time eroded the obstacle. Euphemia's death, sudden and unassailable, cleared the way. Whether by fate or by design, the barrier fell. And Justinian, restless and determined, moved swiftly. He persuaded his uncle, Emperor Justin, to amend the law itself. In a stroke of imperial will, the ancient ban was dissolved. The edict that once declared Theodora untouchable was overturned, and with it, centuries of custom shattered. Their marriage followed not in shadows, but in triumph. Theodora, who had been trafficked, humiliated, discarded, was lifted into the imperial household. And when Justinian at last ascended to the throne, he did not place her beside him as consort, but as Augusta, empress in her own right. At the coronation, she stood not a step behind him, but equal, her purple robes marking her as sovereign, her voice carrying the weight of command. She was no mere wife to an emperor. She was co-ruler of the Eastern Roman Empire. In her eyes burned the knowledge that she had remade her destiny, bent law and empire alike to her will. The girl from the stage was gone. In her place stood an empress draped in purple, ready to wield the throne's full terror and majesty. From slave to empress, that's not just a fairy tale, it's raw ambition meeting opportunity. If you think more people should know these hidden turns of history, share this video, and subscribe to Echoes of Time. And if you won't subscribe, I dare you to tell me why in the comments. Theodora's coronation had scarcely faded from memory before the city turned restless beneath her feet. Constantinople was no quiet capital. It was a furnace of rivalries, and the fire burned brightest in the Hippodrome. Two factions ruled the passions of the people, the blues and the greens. What began as sport, chariot races, wagers, loyalties, bled into politics, religion, and class. The blues, wealthier and orthodox. The greens, poorer, more radical. Their rivalry was not mere rivalry. It was civil war waiting for a spark. That spark came in January of 532. Arrests, executions, and the heavy hand of Justinian's taxation fanned rage into open flame. When the races began, chants of anger drowned the thunder of horses. Blues and greens, enemies for decades, suddenly united, their fury aimed not at each other, but at the emperor himself. Nika! Nika! They screamed, conquer! A word that began as cheer but swelled into rebellion. The city erupted. Flames devoured whole districts as rioters torched palaces, baths, and homes. Mobs surged through the streets, tearing down statues, besieging officials. The Hagia Sophia itself was consumed in the inferno. For 5 days, Constantinople burned, and the throne shook with every stone that fell. Inside the palace, panic reigned. Justinian faltered. He considered flight. Ships were prepared in the harbor, treasures readied for escape. The empire seemed ready to collapse beneath the weight of its own fury. But then Theodora spoke. Calm, cold, unyielding. Her words cut the air sharper than any sword. She declared that while men might prefer safety, she preferred death with dignity. For me, she said, this purple is the noblest shroud. She would not run. She would not abandon her crown. Better to fall in glory than to live in disgrace. Her resolve electrified the room. Where Justinian wavered, she anchored. Where generals hesitated, she commanded. With her words, she chained the emperor to his throne and forced action where cowardice had taken root. The orders came swiftly. Belisarius, the empire's young general, and Mundus, commander of the barbarian mercenaries, encircled the Hippodrome, where tens of thousands of rebels had gathered, believing they were safe. The gates were sealed. Soldiers poured in from every entrance, steel glinting in the smoke. What followed was not battle but butchery. Spears thrust through flesh, swords cut down unarmed men, arrows rained from above. Trapped, the crowd became prey, and the arena, once a place of games, was drowned in blood. When it ended, silence fell heavy. 30,000 bodies lay broken across the sand. The rebellion was crushed, the city subdued, and Justinian's throne secured not by his courage, but by hers. In that moment, Theodora's legacy hardened. She was no longer merely a trafficked girl who had risen to be empress. She was the woman who chose massacre over surrender, who weighed the lives of 30,000 against the survival of an empire and did not flinch. To her, power was not given, it was taken and secured by blood. History remembers this day as both salvation and slaughter. What do you think? Did Theodora save an empire or damn her soul? Tell me in the comments. And if you want more of history's shadows revealed in all their brutality, subscribe to Echoes of Time. The massacre of the Hippodrome secured the throne, but for Theodora, survival was never enough. Power demanded vigilance, and vigilance demanded enemies. In the years that followed, one by one, those who dared to cross her were broken. The first was Pope Silverius. Rome was aflame with intrigue as the Eastern Empire sought to extend its authority over the Church. Silverius, accused of treachery, found himself ensnared in Theodora's web. Some say he had leaned too closely toward the Goths, others that he merely stood in the way of her will. The outcome was the same. Silverius was deposed, stripped of his title, and sent into exile. He would die there, a forgotten pontiff, his downfall etched forever into the shadow of Theodora's influence. Then came Amalasuntha, the Ostrogothic queen who had once been courted as an ally. She was cultured, educated, and a potential partner in stabilizing Italy. Yet alliances shift like sand, and power cannot be shared. Rumors spread that Theodora's hand guided the knife that silenced Amalasuntha in her bath. Her body left as a warning to others who mistook friendship for safety. Whether true or whispered slander, the suspicion alone revealed how deeply Theodora had come to be feared. And then, the most dramatic fall of all. John the Cappadocian, the empire's most formidable minister of finance. He was brilliant, ruthless in squeezing gold from the provinces, and indispensable to Justinian. But his arrogance made him dangerous. He mocked Theodora, underestimated her resolve. She struck not with armies, but with deception. Through her ally Antonina, wife of General Belisarius, John was lured into a trap, ensnared in accusations of conspiracy. His estates were seized, his position annihilated, his pride broken. The man who once held the empire's coffers in his hands was reduced to nothing. The pattern was unmistakable. One by one, rivals vanished. Pope exiled, a queen murdered, a minister destroyed. Whether by dagger, intrigue, or false whispers, Theodora cut down all who threatened her grip. Fear of her name spread from Constantinople to Rome, from the courts of bishops to the palaces of kings. To some, she was the shield of Justinian's throne. To others, she was the black hand behind every shadowed death. What do you think? Was Theodora a defender of her empire, or a tyrant cloaked in purple? Comment your verdict. And if you want more of these ruthless power stories, subscribe to Echoes of Time. Unless you'd rather keep history's shadows hidden. Yet Theodora's story is not told in blood alone. Behind the veil of intrigue and massacre, another face emerges, one often overlooked, yet no less powerful. It is the face of a woman who remembered her own scars, who carried the weight of her past humiliation into the laws of an empire. Theodora knew what it meant to be powerless, to be trafficked and sold. Perhaps because of that, she sought to wield her authority as a shield for others who could not protect themselves. Under her influence, new laws were written, laws that reached into the darkest corners of Constantinople. No longer could men force women into prostitution without penalty. Those who trafficked or coerced were punished with severity, and the system that had once consumed her was, at least in part, shackled by her hand. She went further still. She ordered the creation of safe houses, refuges where exploited girls could escape the cycle that had once bound her. Here, those discarded by society found shelter, food, and a chance at survival outside the theater's degradation. For some, it was the first time their lives were treated as more than property. This was Theodora's paradox laid bare. The same woman who had urged slaughter in the Hippodrome, who cut down rivals without hesitation, also fought to rescue the vulnerable. In her reign, she was at once the liberator and the butcher, the protector and the destroyer. She held both faces without shame, as if she believed they were not opposites, but two halves of the same truth, that power required both cruelty and compassion, and she alone would decide when to wield each. How do you see her? A savior who remembered her suffering, or a tyrant whose kindness was only another form of control? Tell me in the comments. And if you want to keep exploring these haunting paradoxes of history, subscribe to Echoes of Time, where we uncover the truths that refuse to die. Theodora's reign did not end with betrayal or a blade, but with the slow and merciless decay of her own body. In the year 548, while still in her prime, she succumbed, perhaps to cancer, though the exact cause remains veiled by time. The empress who had stood unflinching in the face of riots, who had stared down generals and bent emperors to her will, was at last undone by a foe she could not confront. Constantinople mourned, though whether in grief or in fear of her absence, none could truly say. In the centuries that followed, the Church itself raised her name to the ranks of the saints, canonizing her alongside Justinian. It was a striking transformation, from trafficked child, to courtesan, to empress, to saint. Yet history has never agreed on what she truly was. To some, she was the savior of an empire, the woman whose courage preserved Byzantium when her husband faltered. To others, she was a tyrant, a shadowy figure who wielded poison, intrigue, and massacre as freely as law and mercy. Her name lingers in the memory of Byzantium like a storm on the horizon. Feared, admired, never forgotten. The trafficked girl who rose to the throne, who chose blood over surrender, who protected the weak even as she destroyed her enemies. Theodora remains one of history's most haunting paradoxes. You've walked through the rise, the blood, and the paradox of Empress Theodora. Here on Echoes of Time, we keep digging up history's darkest corners. If you haven't subscribed yet, ask yourself why. And if you refuse, tell us in the comments. History loves debate.